Hello there. In this video we are going to be discussing the primary anatomical features of the nervous system that we as budding biomechanists need to be aware of. And what better place to start than with the human brain, and this is just a 3D model of said structure. Despite the fact it's not relevant to biomechanics, I'll get the first question that I'm sure some of you have out of the way. I usually get this when I've used this in lectures before, this image. What are those little whiskery things there? You can perhaps take a moment, see if you can figure it out. Oh, whoops daisy, sorry if I appear a bit rusty with this software, so I haven't used it for a while. So these two structures here are nerves, and they are the optic nerves, the left and the right optic nerve. So what could be in between those? Well, we have the right and left olfactory bulbs from which the sensory neurons hang down and facilitate our sense of smell. So there we are. Always get asked that one, so I thought we'd get that out of the way. Another point that I see, in fact I don't think I've read a single textbook on neuroanatomy or physiology or the control of neural control of human movement that hasn't at some point quoted what a complex structure the brain is. So let's get that out of the way. There are indeed approximately, God knows who counted them all, but 100 billion specialized cells, neurons, in your brain. So that's an impressive number. Each of those cells forms a connection, a synapse, with up to 1,000 other cells. So this just goes to show you what a complex network of communication we have going on in your cranium. Anyway, let's get on. Whoops, daisy. Some more relevant info. So the outermost region here that we can see, where we can see all these folds are known as the meninges of the brain. This outermost region we refer to as the cerebral cortex of the brain. Now, the cerebral cortex is the outermost layer of the brain. If we were to just look just below this layer, then we would be entering the cerebrum, and that makes up the majority of the brain. So we are viewing the cerebral cortex, the outer layer of the brain. This little structure down here, which in Latin, I think it's Latin, yeah it must be, literally translates to little brain, is the cerebellum, which can be found at the posterior inferior region of the brain. And we'll come on to that in a moment. So as we know, the brain is, and in fact much of the central nervous system is considered as the control center of our nervous system. And as we mentioned earlier, the area that we see here, whoops daisy, again told you I was a bit rusty, there you go, we'll go with that one. This area is known as the cortex, the outermost layer, but we have anatomically subdivided the brain into 4 different regions in order to just make it easier really to describe the role of these different regions. The first, which is perhaps the most easiest to remember just because it makes sense, it's at the front, it's called the frontal lobe. We have 4 different lobes, L-O-B-E. I'm told that sometimes L's don't come across well on this headset that I use when I'm recording videos, so I shall emphasize it here. These are lobes, these regions that we're discussing. We have 4 different lobes. So it's the frontal lobe. Posteriorly to that we have the parietal lobe, and after that we have the temporal lobe. I'm sure you can perhaps guess where this is. Think when you rub your temples, you're rubbing the side of your head, and you'd be right to do so because you're rubbing near this region here. And the fourth lobe is the diminutive and easy to forget, but nonetheless very important, occipital lobe back here, the smallest lobe of the brain. I should point out that the brain is divided into hemispheres, as you can just about see here. So on your left hand side here we have the right hemisphere, and on your right hand side we have the left hemisphere. So this is again being described in the anatomical position, as if the person that we're looking at here, if their brain is facing us, we describe it from their position. And we're not going to get into every function of the brain today, but don't think that the two sides that we have here are carbon copies of each other. The left hemisphere and the right hemisphere are similar and have many shared properties, but there are some specialities in each hemisphere that one side can do that the other can't. But anyway, we won't delve too deep into that at this point. So, what areas do we need to know when discussing human movement and motor control? In fact, we should perhaps start by defining motor control. Motor control is a term that you're going to hear regularly, not just in this module, but in your study of biomechanics in general. It's the motor portion of the phrase that you will hear most regularly. You might hear motor skills, developing motor coordination, but essentially motor control, it really refers to the regulation of movement by your nervous system. Just how well your nervous system does at facilitating your movement means you have good motor control. If movement pattern is poor for whatever reason, then you have poor motor control and needs to be improved. But motor is another way of saying movement. Think of a car, perhaps. Motor control. So, there are several regions of the brain which are important for motor control, and don't ever believe any of the what is it? I was trying to think of the name of a film. I can't think what it's called, but there was a film a while ago, I think I sat through half of it, that suggested that we only use 10% of our brain, and they were trying to maximize the use of the other 90%. Don't ever fall for that myth. The response to that, if anyone ever says that to you, is okay, well, would you be happy with the 90% you're not using just being removed? So to give you an idea of what that would be, the occipital lobe, if I can find it here, on either side, that would be about 10%. Would you be happy with having everything else chopped away? I wouldn't. Don't know about you. You use all of your brain, not necessarily all the time, but at various different points throughout your life and throughout the day. So, let's look at the primary areas of motor control. Now, it's somewhat hard to describe here because I'm just going to highlight specific areas of the brain, but that doesn't mean that the entire area is involved in motor control. So the motor cortex is a connective term for the region of the brain that helps us to perform movement, and it's divided into three regions, or three primary regions, depending on how deep you want to go into your brain anatomy. The first of those is the aptly named primary motor cortex. That can be found in this region here. This is known as the precentral gyrus here. And it's more in the superior region here. Not to say that it doesn't spread down to here and that the rest of the precentral gyrus doesn't perform a role in facilitating our movement, but it seems to be the uppermost region that facilitates movement. The primary motor cortex is the region that allows us to move. It facilitates movement. It stimulates motor neurons. The second most common component of the motor cortex that you'll hear about is the premotor cortex. The premotor cortex is difficult to show on this image here. So between this region here, the precentral gyrus, and this very large chunk of brain matter known as the inferior frontal gyrus, there is a region here in the posterior portion of this area, sort of sandwiched between these two areas, but very much in this area where we believe the premotor cortex exists. So the premotor cortex is believed to be involved in the preparation of movement, which seems odd when you perhaps think about it, but it's the unconscious planning of movement before you actually do it, which is then executed by the primary motor cortex. I say it's believed because we're not 100% certain, but it seems to be the case. It also seems to play a role in controlling or recruiting, I should say, some of our trunk muscles in the body. The third area, which I found it impossible to show you on here, is the supplementary motor area. This is sort of a catch-all term for the other regions of the brain that are involved in motor control. The supplementary motor area is sandwiched between the two hemispheres here, and I can't really show you in this image, but the primary motor cortex is the main area that we are interested in and is pertinent to us. Now, I said we would come back to the cerebellum down here. In fact, just let me arrange this. I'll just pause it and then get it in shot and come back. There we are. There's the cerebellum, the little brain, the mini brain, the tiny brain that we have at the back there. Now, it plays many roles in regulating normal homeostasis in the body, but in terms of movement control, it's perhaps, and you'll see this as a trend as you, particularly if you're interested in the more the clinical health side of things, it's sometimes easiest to see what an organ does in the body if there's something wrong with it, because then you see the dysfunction in whatever it is that was previously working fine. And there is a condition called cerebellar ataxia. Ataxia literally means a loss of muscle control, and cerebellar refers to the cerebellum, which can occur, and those with cerebellar ataxia show a very altered gait pattern, which can involve anything from having a wider stance, reduced ability to control their balance and coordination, general hypotonia. Hypotonia means decreased muscle tone, and so much so it can even, if it's a severe case, cause problems with speech, because obviously our speech is facilitated through the recruitment of muscles. Your vocal cords are muscles that are recruited to produce noise that is then projected through the mouth, of course. overly explained that, don't know why. But as I say, cerebellar ataxia can also be associated with a inability to perform any rapid movements, so any movement that requires a quick reflex response. So it seems to play, and it's relatively new because it seems to play more of a role in facilitating movement than we thought it did. The cerebellum, we thought originally didn't have too much to do with human movement. We thought that movement was just in the motor cortex, in this region here. But people with cerebellar ataxia show a significant issue in their movement patterns, and therefore from that we've been able to understand the role that the cerebellum plays in regulating human movement, particularly balance and motor control. Anyway, let's move on. So, we've discussed the brain. Bear with me, I'm just trying to find... Ah, there it is. The brainstem. There we are. So the brainstem is a intermediate structure, if you like, between the brain and the spinal cord, which we'll come on to in a moment. All of this, as I say, is part of the central nervous system. There are many structures of the brainstem. One that is perhaps of most interest, or two I should say, are the medulla oblongata here, and the structure above it is the pons. You perhaps remember me saying that Parkinson's disease is a movement disorder, and Parkinson's disease originates in the medulla oblongata and gradually spreads up to the pons, and we have dopamine producing cells. Dopamine is, we typically think of as it's the feel-good hormone. Well, it actually plays an important role in movement, and if those cells are destroyed, then our movement is going to be disrupted. And if the condition spreads any further up into the cerebrum, then we start to see symptoms of dementia, specifically Lewy body dementia. But I digress. So let me just set up the spinal cord, bear with me. There we have it. So the spinal cord, again, all part of the central nervous system, is obviously contains fewer cells than the brain, the 100 billion that we have in the brain, but still an impressive 100 million in the spinal cord, so nothing to be sniffed at. The spinal cord has an important role to play in our reflex actions. So whilst the time that it takes to stimulate sensory neurons or on the skin, let's say you burn your hand, let's say you happen to very foolishly lean on something like a hot pot or something that's very hot, and you have to make the decision as to what to do now. So that signal needs to be carried to the central nervous system, and everything goes through the base up the spinal cord, where the brain has to think, hot, should probably move, send out an efferent signal to the skeletal muscles to say, probably need to move that hand now. I'm obviously, saying this with a pinch of salt, but that's a more time-consuming process. That's how most of our movements take place, how our conscious movements take place. A reflex action is a motion which bypasses the brain. So the signal comes in to the base of the spine, and then a decision is made here to stimulate the relevant muscles in order to facilitate the movement that we want. So it doesn't travel up to the superior portion of the central nervous system. It's primarily located primarily takes place down here at the base of the spine. And finally, we don't have the entire layout here because that would crash the software. We have the peripheral nervous system, but that's a topic for our next video.